In your studies, you will frequently encounter two terms which sound rather similar and which are sometimes used interchangeably: comparative literature and world literature. Now, you may wonder what the difference is, and I'm going to explain some of the history of the two terms to you today to help you use them more effectively. The first thing that we can say in answer to our question about the difference between comparative literature and world literature is that comparative literature is the name of our academic discipline and world literature is the name of the object of study. In fact, you will probably find that since the beginning of the 21st century, the term world literature has increasingly come to replace comparative literature. So you now also have degree programs which are called BA in World Literature or MA in World Literature. Why is this? I would like to suggest that the reason why there's been a shift from the term comparative literature to world literature is because the word comparative is perceived as problematic. And the reason why it is perceived as problematic is because it is taken to suggest a focus on the relation between different national canons in national languages, which are treated as basically existing prior to and independently from comparison. Let me unpack this idea. You're all familiar with the traditions of learning in the national literary disciplines, for example, in English, and you all recognize that, say, Shakespeare, for example, is a text that you would read in the context of a degree in English studies. Now, would you also read Shakespeare in the context of a degree in comparative literature? The idea of comparison might be taken to suggest that Shakespeare can only be read by a comparatist if his works are read in relation, say, to Goethe or Rabelais or any other playwright. So the value of the literary value of Shakespeare's plays in their own right would not be of concern to comparative literature, which is a subject which would only be defined by its attention to the comparison. You could only work as a comparatist if you take an object of analysis A and another object of analysis B, and you compare them by explaining the differences and similarities between them. So I'd like to sort of show to you today this is not an appropriate and helpful definition of our field of study. So when we say that we study comparative as opposed to English, French, German, Chinese, or Russian literature, say, we may convey the idea that we are in fact not interested in any of these canons or in any of these national traditions in their own right, but in the relation between them. According to this assumption, then, the study of, say, Shakespeare would not be part of the discipline of comparative literature. The study of Rabelais would not be part of the research that we do in the discipline of comparative literature, but the comparative study of Shakespeare and Rabelais, the comparison between them, would be what defines our discipline of study. Now, it's important to understand that what we do in a comparative literature degree is not simply compare in this narrow sense. And I'm going to make this point by showing you a short reflection by the Emeritus Professor of Comparative Literature, Peter Brooks, who writes in 1995, and I'm going to read this to you now. Although I hold a PhD in comparative literature, I have never been sure I deserved it, since I've never been sure what the field or the discipline is, and never sure that I could really claim to be teaching it or working in it. I imagine that many young comparatists were asked, as I was, by well-meaning laypersons, well, what do you compare? The answer, I recall, began with a mumbled admission that you didn't really compare anything. You simply worked in more than one literature, studying literature without regard to national boundaries and definitions. So what Peter Brook says here, in other words, is that he, like in fact perhaps many of you, has been asked why comparison is so central to his particular field of study. What do you compare? Do you compare French and English? Do you compare Spanish and Italian? And what he tried to sort of say, and he describes this as a mumbled admission, is that in fact, if you work in comparative literature, you don't compare anything. You work in more than one literature. You don't restrict your interest to one particular language or one particular national canon. You study literature, as he says, without regard to national boundaries and definitions. Now, I'm going to go back further in time to 1965, and I'm going to read to you a definition of comparative literature, which comes from the so-called Levine Report on Professional Standards. So this is a group of researchers in 65 who seek to define comparative literature as a field of study. And I'm going to ask you, as I read this, to reflect on what, if anything, may appear problematic now. How can we tell that this is a definition which dates back more than 40 years and which is the expression of a different kind of sort of university system and a different set of priorities and assumptions about the arts and humanities. So I'll read this to you now. In a subject which thrives upon the diversity of the minds it attracts, no single canon ought to be laid down as the qualifications of candidates. Ideally speaking, they ought to possess both linguistic competence and critical aptitude to a high degree. In practice, they often tend to be weighted somewhat more on one side or the other. We should seek for balance in this respect, just as we balance the counterclaims of coverage and depth. It should be frankly recognized that a PhD in comparative literature may take longer to acquire than one in most of the separate areas of language and literature. And if a candidate has any hesitations between the straight degree and ours, he may well be encouraged to make the more traditional choice. If we profess to cover more ground than our sister departments, we should honestly acknowledge that we must work harder, nor should we incur their suspicion by offering shortcuts. Now, I asked you to think about what, if anything, is problematic about this, and from my perspective, the first thing that strikes me when I read this is certainly the use of the male pronoun he to describe so he may well be encouraged to make the more traditional choice to describe the candidate. We wouldn't have that now in an academic text, I don't think. We would use a gender-neutral term, and but much more generally speaking, what this text articulates is an idea of comparative literature as a kind of sort of master discipline in the arts and humanities. So what the Levine report says is that other PhD programs may focus on one particular language and literature. So if you want to become a Germanist, you have to learn to be fluent in German and so on. But comparative literature takes longer to acquire than most of the separate areas of language and literature, because a comparatist needs to sort of engage with all the different languages that are relevant. So that when they refer to the counterclaims of coverage and depth, the coverage means representation of all the different languages, and depth means sufficiently profound engagement with the different national canons and curricula. And this idea of the master discipline is articulated here simply by saying that comparatists have a broader range than people working in other disciplines in the arts and humanities because we work harder. Now, why is this problematic? 1965, in the context of the Levine Report, was an age in which researchers could have legitimately been expected to focus on just a few Western European languages. Now, of course, we are much more aware that culture and literature is a global phenomenon, and that no single researcher would be able to master all the languages or read all the texts that are in principle relevant to comparison. So this idea of the master discipline, even if we imagine a kind of sort of ideal candidate, even if we imagine a sort of brilliant linguist who is also a great theoretical thinker who has mastered 5 or 6 or 7 languages, this person would still fall dramatically short of the expectations of the subject. So we encounter here for the first time a problem which we will meet again and again in the course of our studies, which is the problem of impossible demand. The comparative literature as a discipline, if we imagine it not simply as a comparison between two imaginary fixed and stable national canons, but we imagine it as a synthesis of different cultural expressions in different languages, comparative literature becomes unmanageable. It's too vast. So I'm going to wrap up this short session by asking you to think about 2 more recent definitions. One is the definition provided by Stephen Zepetnek, who in his book Comparative Literature, Theory, Method, Application, says that the focus of comparative literature is not the what, but the how. So what distinguishes us from other disciplines is not that we read more or that we focus only on the relations between cultures, but that we are able to move and to dialogue between cultures, languages, literatures, and disciplines. And a more influential definition is the definition provided by David Damrosch in this book, What is World Literature, in 2003. And you see that the focus has shifted from comparative to world literature precisely for this reason. Damrosch says what we work with is not world literature as an infinite, ungraspable canon of works, but rather as a mode of circulation and of reading. And then he says, I'm going to read this to you, a mode that is as applicable to individual works as to bodies of material, available for reading established classics and new discoveries alike. And his book, he says, is intended to explore this mode of circulation and to clarify the ways in which works of world literature can best be read. It is important from the outset to realize that just as there's never been a single set canon of world literature, so too no single way of reading can be appropriate to all texts or even to any one text at all times. The variability of a work of world literature is one of its constitutive features. And then this is in a sense, Damrosch's idea in a nutshell: literature gains in translation. So David Damrosch says, what we study when we study world literature is not a kind of sort of infinite list of texts, but the ways in which these texts relate to each other and the ways in which we read them. So, and in fact, he says translation is very important because texts travel through translation in different languages, and texts gain through translation. So if a text is translated in many different languages, it becomes a more multifaceted cultural phenomenon. So we've come a long way from Peter Brook's anxiety, and we've certainly come a very long way from the kind of sort of idea of comparative literature as a master discipline that was articulated by the Levine Report in 1965. We are looking at comparative literature, or now perhaps more sort of correctly as at world literature, not as a canon, but as a pattern of circulation, as the many different ways in which we can read texts. So if we focus, for example, on French literature from a particular age as world literature, we are interested in the ways in which these texts were in principle of interest to audiences globally, in which they sort of drew from sources written in other languages and were subsequently available to readers who read them in other languages. So this, of course, also includes attention to the works themselves. So we're not just comparing, but we're in a sense sort of developing a more robust and richer basis for our textual analysis. And one final quotation by Claudio Guillén in a book called The Challenge of Comparative Literature. Guillén reminds us that we should approach comparative literature as an affinity, a desire, an activity chosen over other activities. So he says, more than any particular methodology, what really defines comparative literature is this desire to go beyond cultural nationalism, beyond using literature in nationalistic ways for ideological ends, and to unravel the characteristics of literary communication as such. And he says in the final part of this long quotation that he wants to elude the snare of definitions. So he doesn't want to sort of provide a definitive explanation of what world literature is or what comparative literature is, but he wants to sort of treat the field as a yearning rather than as an object. A yearning that has already been in existence for a good number of years and that will remain. So following on from this, we will also use our session today to think about the history of comparative literature as a discipline. And we will see that the history of comparative literature as a discipline is crucially defined by the concept of world literature.